Okay, everyone, here's a test run trying to use Zoom in a combination with reviewing the material for our expert working group. So I'm going to start with historical trauma and walk through the thoughts that I was thinking of when I put it all together and kind of do a short overview of the presentation. So when we get to the point of having comments and all that, you all will have an understanding of what I was thinking. So, sharing screen, go there. Okay. Come on now. And then we'll get the slideshow. Okay. So with the historical trauma, this is the opening screen, have the general title inside of there, the impact on communities of color, mainly because that we want to have as much lateral movement with the topic as possible, so it's not just concentrating on Native communities, Black communities, Latino communities, and being mindful of that. When I think of this quote, and normally when I present, I don't really read the slides so much. So I'll talk about the context of what the message is saying in the slide versus actually reading to the people what the slide is. It's a different way for an adult learner to absorb information. So some people will watch you as a presenter and speak, and other people like to read things. And so different ways of taking in information. So talking about historical trauma, saying this is a result of something that happens in the past, and it may affect us still to this day, even though something has long occurred, way, way far back in time. But there's certain things that happen, certain behaviors and actions that shaped a group of people's behavior because of that event or those events. So this whole practice of it could either be discipline or how we interact with institutions or whatever it may be, it is a way that a community shaped and then has owned that type of practice as a result of that trauma. So looking at colonization, here's one of the things that it goes across the globe. Any type of colonization of any communities, this is what's usually going on. And for this country, for sure, the practice of colonization impacted Native people highly, and that loss of that hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And part of that identity of hunter-gatherer lifestyle was also embedded in the culture. The way that we moved around and the way that we learned and the way that we taught was based upon the different seasons and the different cycles. And we went to other areas for training our youth on different survival techniques. We went to other areas to collect medicine. During winter, we moved to other areas where there was food. And all of these things just are just part of it, that natural cycle, that natural connection with nature and with the earth, and living in relationship with the earth. Our values and our systems of not dominating, exploiting, and all those other things were part of why we did not stay in one place very long. It's very natural to understand that you can't have 100 people living off 1 square acre of land and think that it's sustainable. At some certain point, you're going to burn all the wood for heat. You're going to eat everything down to every last blade of grass and every grub in the dirt in order to have food. And there's no way that people will be able to survive. So you have to move along, and you didn't use up all your resources all at once. You didn't chop down all the trees, you chopped down one tree. You got things prepped and all these other things from different areas. You didn't hunt out a whole herd. You didn't go and kill how many rabbits you can get in one day. You got enough for your meal, enough to feed yourself or your family or your community. if it's a big hunt. If someone's getting deer or buffalo, whatever, it's going to be big. So losing that lifestyle, we go into the piece about how it leads to poor nutrition. We are no longer moving around. We are more docile. We plant crops that can be recycled over and over again, or have a little less variety inside of them. So when you think of people who plant gardens, you know, think of any garden, you're going to get the same 4 things in there. You're going to have tomatoes, you're going to have a cucumber, you're going to have some lettuce, and you're going to have some onions. That's pretty much, you know, throw a carrot or something and some squash here and there, maybe beans, but really your top 5 are going to be pretty much the same no matter whose garden you go in. You're going to find those same things, right? So the diversity of food also lessens the nutrition, and then also access to other food, bigger games, and things like that. So processed food becomes a big part as well. Our birth weight, diabetes, all these other things that we lived off of very well. Nowadays in this country, we think that we're large meat eaters. The United States actually is, but we think that we need to have meat every day, but that wasn't the reality. Meat was actually something that was very far in between. We had a high fiber diet way back in the day, and now we don't have those things, and we get all these other things like diabetes and gout and hypertension and clogged arteries, all that fun stuff. And so you think of these other things where it leads up over here to the respiratory disease, ear disease, and all of that stuff. Start shifting back the other way to these loss of culture and nutrition and all these other things, and part of that cultural genocide and the component that goes with it, with children being stolen one way or another, right? So Black community slavery, Native people into boarding schools or abducted into military schools, a lot of the same similarities. And when people are pulled out of there, when children especially are pulled out from their family connections, they don't have that root. They don't have those people that are with them and who can teach them and help them understand what that is. What are those cultural norms? What's my role in my family as a brother or a sister or as a cousin? And then later on, as I grow, what's the obligation to my community? What are my gifts that I bring? What are the lessons I learn? And what are my responsibilities as an aunt, uncle, parent, grandparent? So you have this whole piece, right? All this stuff is going along because of the dominant culture not really accepting of these different groups of people. So either the inherent ability to use people for whatever they want, or the fact is that these people need to become more civilized or acculturated in one way or another, but yet you will never be 100% in that group, right? So you're going to be marginalized, you're going to be pulled from this group, marginalized out of this group, but then end up in some bubble in between these two groups where you're also not fitting in with that group again. And so you lose all these other things and all these other connections and support, and then you don't know. And as it happens to this generation, and then you lose, let's say 25% of that knowledge. The next generation that comes in, so you have your children, you're going to lose another percentage of that knowledge, and then another percentage and another percentage, because all of this funneling of information and gearing everyone to be colonized and have this great melting pot of America, right? So these conditions creating the unemployment, poverty, poor education, is all about that access. Who has power and access to power? You're not afforded the same opportunities. You know, people are not, because of the racism and all the stereotypes that are part of it. There's limited roles for you. And then you have the issues around alcohol, substance abuse that'll start feeding in there. So some of it is self-medicated, that you're just self-medicating because you're not able to deal with this trauma, and that's a way to avoid dealing with it. The other part of it, sometimes when you have nothing to do, you're just going to pass time. Drug and alcohol is just to pass time, and some of it is also just antisocial behavior, right? You know, you just want to be rebellious, you want to do whatever you want, you do, you know, what makes you feel good and feel free. So that's part of that. And then because you have these connections too, you can always have this domestic violence area, violence, Talk about deaths in custody. Part of that's the police and people being bound up or beaten or restrained too much, you know, choke off airways or restrain them in a way where they can't breathe or have heart attacks and things like that. And so all these loop back to poor nutritions and these other things. And when you don't have the good, stable community, you end up also in these fixed settlements and these camps, ghettos, projects, whatever there's going to be around, right? We got reservations in the communities, very limited housing, no opportunity for housing. There's all these other issues related to it that just don't match up with how people can do economic development around housing in an urban area because of land issues. Land ownership, the real estate value on reservations, tribal lands are in federal trust, meaning that the federal government holds onto the property for the exclusive access of the native peoples. And therefore the bank can't come in and seize that. So when you try to put up money for a house and you have no collateral, which in most places, any city, it's going to be the land is what the collateral is, or any structures on there are also valuable collateral. You can get those loans. But when you don't have that in a tribal rural community, you have no land, you have no collateral, you have nothing really to put up. And so that's part of why it's so hard to have housing, or there's so many housing issues in native areas. All right, so when we look at the impact of war and all the genocide, all of these behaviors are part of that norm. The death, violence, looting, fighting, all that other stuff. When you're going to take over another territory or people, the conquest is to take over their resources. And that's a major part of it. Why are people fighting over things? It's because I need more things for survival. If I'm on my 1 acre of land with my 100 people, eventually I'm going to need some wood, and I'm going to have to go over to my neighbor's area to get wood. If they don't have a bunch of wood, we might band together and then go find someone who's at a large forested area. And so those are those things that you start doing, is to start looting and taking over stuff. People aren't going to, if they're just not going to outright give it to you, then you go take it from them. You know, use of violence, death, these other things. You got people who will run away from that, right? You'll be fleeing. Anyone who's a refugee or any of those things, those are people who are leaving those type of things. And then you have the aftermath. All these other things after someone's taking control of the land. What do you do with the people? What happens with that? Or if someone attacked and failed, what's the reparations for that? What are kicking up people who left and you're not going to have them come back? Relocation, all those other things. And so looking at indirect and direct pathways, what are the conversations that link us directly to our current situations? How do we get these links to here from being economically disadvantaged, extra household burdens, feelings of hurt, conflict, social exclusion? Because these other things, you're left, once you're a conquered person, you're that whole thing like, oh, you lost, you're the losers. Any sports contest, right? You're going to glorify the winner, the champion. They get all the recognition. You're like, oh, you guys didn't try hard enough. So, you know, you're not as good, right? Even though you made it to the championship game, you didn't win a championship game, you're the second runner-up over 30 other teams, you're still not that good. Indirect conflict are all these internal things, all these struggles that are more that internal type of struggle. You know, they're your support, your ability to provide for your family, those burdens, the productivity, exclusion, conflicts, all this other stuff, all that stuff that comes from that internal stress of those things. If you're kicked out or you're left or your area is ravaged by war, these things are going to happen. And also when you think of the war, that conquest of this country, right? That's all that has been happening. And wars in other countries. It was conquest of lands and all those pieces that brought Black people over here through slavery. It's also the same colonization that happened over there, the same colonization that happened in South America and in North America, in all parts of the country, or globe, I should say. So here's the activity that I would have people do. Just sit back and watch. Or not sit back and watch. Have people sit in small groups and at their table and go through conversations like this and say, when they think of colonization and how has colonization impacted these different groups of people. Native Americans, African Americans, quite obvious. Holocaust survivors might be a little bit different. Oops. Japanese internment survivors. That one comes up so infrequently. But also Hispanics and Latinos. And, you know, we might not think of this population as like, oh, okay, this is an oppressed or colonized group so much, but, you know, because they got a country, right? Mexicans have Mexico. You know, we don't have Ojibwe land or any of those type of things for other native groups. You got a country still. You know, we got a reservation. But when you think of the language, right? What's the language that people speak? It's not their indigenous language anymore. What's the major cultural things inside of that group? You know, there's a lot of Catholicism, a lot of the saints. Think of the music, think of the language. They speak Spanish, right? You know, there's no indigenous Spaniards. That language comes from across the seas. And then so all the other things too with Asians, war refugees, and intergenerational poverty like we have in the southeast part of the country. So largely white Americans, but have that intergenerational poverty. And that has a different impact as well. So here are some of the examples that come afterwards. So after leaving this list up there and having people have a conversation, you know, 5-10 minutes of conversation, then ask people to then share some of those thoughts that they have as a group, back to a large group. And then I would move to this slide afterwards. You know, because people will say some of these things and have, you know, some people may link them together very well and can articulate what those are, but here's just an idea of a list that may come up. And also this piece here, and then so start connecting, right? Start connecting back what happened to us as groups of people individually and where we might carry that trauma today, and then bringing it to this point of this slide. And that we have the cumulative exposure to traumatic events, not just individuals, but continue to go generation after generation after generation. Like every single time there's a military action of some sort, right, that triggers people. Anytime there's a police brutality, that triggers people. And that just happens again and again and again. I like the examples of anyone who grew up fighting Civil War. That's, you'd be pretty old growing up fighting Civil War back nowadays, fighting for civil rights and seeing how the police came in and smashed up communities and beat people up, dragged them off to jail. And then you still see that today with individual police brutality. Anytime someone gets pulled over, anytime you see a black man getting arrested, beat up, whatever's going to happen, it goes back to those same things, back to civil rights, 50s, 60s era, and even before that with non-institutional police action, Klan action, racism, people just being killed, and farther and farther back. So when you have this untreated trauma and that message being passed on to the world, a lot of people say, well, that's just, you're just training your kid, you're conditioning your kid to be fearful of everything. And they're not understanding the fact is of what you're passing on and what you're training is about survival. I have to tell my kids to watch out for police because it's important for their survival. If they're just thinking nonchalantly they can go up and act or do and say whatever they want, the chances of them getting a harsh treatment is more than likely than a white person would. It's just that's the way it is. People have inherent fear. They have subconscious fear. You're taught to be fearful of brown people. So that's a big issue. And so here is different subtypes getting into this, and that we're all dealing with this time and time again, and that If we're not dealing with it and we're not understanding it, then we're just going to pass it on again and again and again. And the thing is that when we have this type of trauma going on, that we start to blame other people oftentimes without understanding where the roots are. So when we see people acting up, that we want to exert our type of control over them, right? We start to mimic that behavior. We as brown people, have been treated in such a way, and that we've learned this ways of dominance, how to get what you want. You make threats, you coerce people, you'll take things by force. That's how we've learned to treat each other and interact with one another, because we had that done to us way in the past. If we didn't comply with what someone said, you got whipped if you're a black person. If you're a Native person, you had food withheld, you got disease, you got smallpox, you got killed, you got shot, you got run off your land, you got all these other things. And then when you get taken out of that, and either you're putting into some type of institution, it may be jail, it may be boarding schools, and that when you're beaten for speaking your language or acting the way you act or doing other things non-white, you get this punishment. And then on top of that, we know for Native communities in particular that physical and sexual abuse that happens inside of boarding schools is something that the children brought home when they were adults, back into the community. It's a behavior that they learned, and it's a behavior that they carried on back in their community, and they didn't know any different. And so we have these things going on generation to generation to generation, but we also start to learn where you're in a different power group. You're getting higher and higher in your status. As an adult, we have power and access to information that children don't have. And so when we think of these things that go on in society and that mimicking of this power structure, that we know children have issues that they're going through. We know children have to deal with poverty. They have to deal with violence. They have to deal with physical and sexual abuse. But they don't have the access to resources in order to change anything about their life. And so when we see kids acting up, we say, oh, those are some badass kids. Look at them kids, you know, they're selling drugs, they're in gangs, they're fighting, they're stealing, all these other things. But we're not looking at what's the condition in which they are living. They're living in a condition in which they have to survive. And so by selling drugs when they're young or stealing food, all these other things, it's part of their survival. So we're not looking at what are the condition our children are living with. We are blaming them for trying to survive. And really what they're showing are those symptoms. Let's see, where is it? And that's where I use my own quote, right? We blame youth for showing the symptoms of trying to survive in the violent world us adults fail to change for them. And really what that's talking about is that we were young and we had adults ahead of us and we had to navigate and survive in this world. And so we learned survival and we've had to adapt in order to thrive in our next world. But yet we forget from that childhood to the adult age what that meant and what that means. And so as we become adults, we get locked into adult thinking and be like, okay, now I'm an adult and these are the things I need to do. And when we do that, we start to ignore and forget the fact that, wait a minute, when we were kids, we didn't like this stuff, or sometimes we just forget about it, you know, right? We get happy that now we have the power and we can do whatever we want and no one's telling us what to do, so we feel good. And then it's like, yeah, whatever. You do that, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I did it. You can do it. Try to be successful. Or we just eventually get brainwashed into the adult cycle of survival. Get a job, have a house, work very hard, the American dream, and get consumed with consumerism and material things that we start to ignore these other things that matter in the world. We get sucked into politics, someone else's game of politics, whatever it may be going on. And it's a real distraction from what we really need in order to have a healthy community. So here's some of the ways that we can experience trauma. All the different examples we probably may have talked about, or the group that you're presented to may have talked about. I think one of the things about historical trauma is that we don't always need to come in and think that everyone has been affected or have the same experiences as one another. I will have a different experience being a Native person and growing up in an urban environment versus a Native person who grew up over in the Southwest versus a Native person who grew up over in the Northeast, up in Maine, Vermont, you know, somewhere in that area. You're gonna have a totally different response. And I think some of the things, and for Native community that I can really only speak to, is that that it all varies on how much contact you had, first contact with non-Native people, then how much interaction afterwards. What was your contact? A lot of the areas had churches, Episcopalian, Catholic, all Christian denominations, Catholic Church, all the way around. You have coming into Alaska, out from the south and through Mexico, and then in the Plains area, Central Park, Northwest, or northern Midwest of the United States had a lot of military contact. So that whole Plains category, a lot of their influence was military, and so they have a different sort of impact in reality when it comes to fighting and standing up for rights. There's a very different reaction to it. Some of us over that have more Christian, Catholic influences, we have a different way of standing up to it than military. It would be more of a combative way of looking at it. I think the other thing too is that we have to realize that we're still here. We can't overlook the resilience and strength of us as individuals and our communities. If trauma made us incapacitated, if trauma incapacitated us enough where we could not do anything, we would just not be here. But we know that there's the ability that we have to navigate and thrive and do these other things in order to continue to survive. But also, we also have to think of where our actions and behaviors come from. We hear this one for Black communities all the time. Black women or Black people, they hit their kids. They spank their kids. That's just, things that people do. I hear it in Native communities as well, that, when people stopped hitting their kids, that's when they got more disrespectful. And somehow the kids today are more disrespectful than, they were in their generation, but somehow they learn better. They learn to be better people because they were hit. However, these people are still perpetuating violent, teachings and notions like that. And so when we think of where that violence and that gaining compliance come from, and we accept that, we are taught to believe that because we no longer know that option. We don't know where that came from anymore. And when we go back to look at historical trauma and things that we lost, we have to identify where are the tools and what's the knowledge and pieces that we don't practice anymore, but they still exist. An example is with my grandma, my Ojibwe grandma. It was always the thing about how do you have that bond with your child? How do you create that? The idea of that child is being valuable and to be given unconditional love. And some of that comes down into family structures. You always had the parents in charge of the youngest child. And you had the grandparents who helped out with the older children, but also older children helped with the children that were underneath them as well. And the practice and the structure of child rearing is that whatever happened, that mother and father were not to break that parent-child bond. So they were not to discipline those child. They were not to yell at that child, be mean to that child, physically mistreat that child, because that connection and that child needs with those parents was considered that valuable. And so when it came down to discipline and things like that, it was the aunties and uncles who did the disciplining. They were the ones who corrected you, did your scolding. You always had that uncle who duff you up a little bit, mess with you, and particularly if you're acting up, they're the ones who gave you crap and set you straight. So those are the things that we have in the past, and all of our communities have these ways that family, extended family, were involved in child rearing. That whole statement about it takes a village to raise a child is not a mistake. It's not something someone made up. It's based on real practices and the reality of many communities. All right, I have to go back to, all right. So, when we think of those things, right, those behaviors and ways of child rearing that were there, that the whole concept of bringing someone in and bringing them closer. There's a very compassionate way of doing things. So you didn't have to physically hit your child in order to change your child's behavior. I had distraction, redirecting, all these other things are ways that parents used and were taught in order to correct children's behavior. Nowadays, we make threats. If our kids don't do something, our posture, our voice, hey son, I need you to go do your homework right now. And they're like, no, Dad, I'm gonna do it later. And you're like, no, you're not. You're gonna do it right now. And they're gonna complain, and then their resistance against us will come, and then we'll start to amp it up. And then we'll start to make threats. First of all, the threatening, the physical behavior, the tone of voice, we might get close to them. We might threaten to take away allowance. We might threaten to take away computer, telephone, all these other things. Little kids, we put them in timeout, right? That's isolation. And we look at the power and control wheel in domestic violence cases, and you look at tactics of blame, making threats, the coercion, the intimidation, all these other things. Those are those tactics that we learn in society. They're very normal in society, but all of those tactics are a part of this colonization and tactics connected to taking over land, resources, and people connected to colonization. And so that same threat and everything else is still there, and we learn those things about gaining power and maintaining power over everyone else. So you get this hierarchical structure that we're believing in these, when most of our indigenous practices were circular. It was about shared power and connection, and that relationship is what's valued. And so that relationship and that connection between parent-child, grandparent-child, all those other things were valued because it kept you as an individual solid. You got that support. So there's a lot of people who say these things in retaliation, mostly white people. I'll just put it out there. Sometimes you get Black, Native, and other people saying, well, look at me, I'm a success. You get some people who just go into it. Like, I don't know how many Native people are priests. That's part of it. And so that taking that identity and separating from what's an individual's belief system versus what is someone ignoring those things. Like, if someone's really into the church, a Native person, I'm not going to get on them for being in the church because the process and the teachings are good. It's when you get people who are across the line and get pushy with that kind of stuff is where I'm like, okay, now you're extending your belief beyond your boundaries. The other thing is that there's not a neutral, no agree to disagree. Not when it comes to oppression and violence and what historical trauma truly is. Historical trauma is what's happened in the past and what structures of oppression have been put in place. They're now institutional and they're now societal. And so we have intereconomic. So the social side of it, we got these class systems on who's better than whom, usually on color of skin. The lighter, the better. The darker, the worse. Your economics, who's got more money, and the more poor, less wealth you have, the less valuable you are. So even people of color who acquire more wealth, they stand very proud, you know, show off their money, show off their wealth, throw off cars, show off jewelry. Meanwhile, you poor people down there, like, forget you all. Doesn't matter if you're a superstar talent athlete or you made it as a rapper, whatever it may be. There's this whole thing about status and echelon, and, you know, you're not good enough. So now here's another activity for people to do. Largely, we're really thinking about people of color doing this activity. When you think of historical trauma, we want, again, people to be in small groups. You may want to mix them up. You can have them count off in numbers of 4, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and have all the people who are number 1s be at one table, number 2s at a different table, number 3s, number 4s, just to get people moved around so it's not the same people and same dynamics going on in the group. And it's particularly important when you're presenting and doing interactive activities to move around the tables. You can't just stand in a room or sit down at a chair and just look at the time and then not do anything. You have to have the movement around the room to help people and just to hear where people are in some of the conversations they're having. So if I were to answer, what's the impact on me today with historical trauma? What does that mean? I have a mixed identity, right? Like, so my dad's black and white, and my mom's Native. So as an individual, now I have to say, like, which one am I picking more, right? Which one am I say I identify with? Because most people think I'm Mexican. And so I'm like, okay, so I just sort of lean towards Native a little bit more. Even though as a child I grew up in the black community, North Side, Minneapolis. That's where our family was. North Side is mixed. It was largely black and Native way back when too. And so in that community or as an individual, like you're forced to pick who you are. Like you have to have one. It's kind of, you know, you get a little bit more solid in who your identity is. You're not just a person. Your identity is shaped by how you fit in with other people and how you're defined by other people. What my relatives do, a lot of politics in there. You get a lot of politics. The way people treat each other, a lot of people have pride, black pride on one side, Native pride on the other, and there's a lot of identity and showing off the culture. So whether you wear your clothes that represents an ethnicity or a style or a dress or music or whatever it is, it's all about showing that off. You know, I don't know why every Native person feels they need a dream catcher or a feather hanging from their mirror, but you know, my relatives would have that one way or another. It's going to hang something, have a sticker, whatever. You can tell an Indian person's car. It's got some kind of Indian item on it. And how does it impact our community? Well, we get a lot of power struggle in the community as one example. We get that internalized oppression. We get fighting, like no one supports one another. It's all about survival, king of the hill. You climb over, you put other people down in order to get what you want. And then how it impacts us as a people, as a society. We still get issues around a generalization that we are less than, black people are lazy and poor, black women stay on welfare, Native men are alcoholics. You know, there's really, people don't really talk about Native women. It's just that Native women are murdered and go missing and all these other things at an astronomical level than any other group in this freaking country per capita. So the results of those things are very different. How we navigate the world in those different areas also changes. So this one I thought was really interesting, this slide, how it affects where you're at. And I thought it was a very interesting one to put in there that we're going to talk about. Trauma affects where we start. So I was born living in the projects by 2 high school dropouts with no money and very little advanced. Like I'm starting pretty low at the bottom on economic standing here. And so when you think about that, where we start from and how far we're going to go, where's that starting line? I'm going to be starting back here, and someone else with more money, smarter parents, more resources, more connections, more whatever is going to be up here. So I have that much more room, you know, behind the person who's got a little bit more solid a foundation. As we're growing, our education is a big component of that. When you have this historical trauma and when you're in a dominant culture education system, they're going to be telling you things that you're not going to agree with, or is not what you heard in your family, not the reality of your experience. Who you read about, who the heroes are, who the leaders are not reflective of you. So there's already a disconnect there that this is not about me. This information is not for me when you have that type of education. And then where do you go? What's your employment? What's your income? What conditions you have? What assets transfer? Like didn't have nothing. Like I knew when I moved out of the house when I was 18, I was not coming back. Like we had oftentimes on public assistance, and we were in public housing, some good, some bad. Throughout the way, but there was no income. Like we grew up in an environment where every summer our phone, light, or gas was cut off. One of those or a combination of those. You know, we managed to keep one of those on at least at one point in time. And eventually, when we got old enough to work and get a job, I've been working since I was 14 years old. We got our own phone line at 15. We were 15 years old in our own house, separate than my mom's phone line, because we got tired of it being cut off. And since we were 14 years old, we were, or 14 was first got a job, but ever since we were 15 years old, we started contributing to the household bills. Like we couldn't save our money and do these other things that a lot of other more advantaged kids have. They get to put money away. They get to have summer jobs and put that away for college, buy a car, whatever it is. We're using it to help ensure that we have food, lights, heat, hot water. Every summer, it was a guarantee we definitely were not going to have gas. And we always had cold showers all summer long. And the jobs I had was landscaping and mowing and, you know, cleaning up old apartments. I had to take a freaking cold shower every day, every morning when I got up and every evening when I got home from work. So that was those very different conditions that you have in those households. And there was no money to transfer when I'm going out. I couldn't call my mom and say, Mom, I need help. I could call my dad. You know, my dad was way off somewhere else doing something different. Can't do those things. And then, like, where is your success? Where is your value? And those things creep on you as an individual too. Okay, am I just a janitor, or am I someone going to school, or do I got a good job? Do I have a professional job? Do I have a blue collar job? All these other things that are big parts of that. And that's part of the active professional life. How much you have to move around and how much violence and things surround you in the community affects how long you stay in one occupation or not. You can have someone, you could be being battered, you can have a stalker, you can have something going on, and then every time you get settled, you have to move or run or hide, and you can't maintain roots. You can't provide that. And then that, again, you have your children, the next generation, who are starting up with this whole cycle all over again. And then when it comes down to retirement age, how much money you have? Look at how many people we have who are still like Walmart greeters because they need income because they can't fully retire. You know, part of the impact of poverty, part of that not having the ability to save money and build up in retirement, and then we're definitely not going to have anything to pass on to our children. So part of that last slide that affects where we start is this ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so these 10 areas of trauma, and the more of these you experience, the harder the struggle you're gonna have in order to thrive inside of life. Like all these other things you're gonna have to deal more deal with more as an adult, and you're just gonna have that many more challenges and obstacles against you. We might need an activity for the ACEs. I'm trying to think. It's been a while since I put this slide in here, so I don't exactly remember what I was thinking when I put it in there. But I thought it was important to say, hey, these are some of these things that affect where we start. Going back to this one, the childhood, education, occupation, income, and conditions. This is part of it, all of those conditions. And then you have this trickle-down effect that goes on. And this talks about how we pass on these behaviors, the genotype. And so what we're passing down in that exposure, that because of our protection and our need and our conditioning of children in order to survive, we pass down these things. Some of it is the way, like you can go in depth and find the science behind it and physiological mutations of genes and all these other things, different stress hormones and all this other stuff, the hyperactivity, like it goes that deep. And then this one is talking about the more of the genetic and environmental influence, or the combination of both. And so it shapes the way it passes down. And so then you have another generation. So if something happened to me, like a traumatic experience, like someone I knew fell through the ice and died, I would have a very different view towards ice. And I might pass that down to my kids. And my children may continue that same level of fear towards ice, or they may not, but definitely they're going to have something imprinted in their head about going out on ice. And we'll have a multi-generational transition is when that same type of conditioning gets passed down to another generation. We see a lot of this in particular with police brutality. And any type of police or forced response, armed response in the community. And so multi-generational issues going on. Our systems look different nowadays, right? Like you had like a slave master and you had someone whipping you, but it was all about that one slave owner. Now the slave owner is a business, it's a corporation, and that corporate will, and anything you do to protest and go against that corporate will, they have the institutions to support them. You think of the Occupy Wall Street, 99% type movement. A lot of corporate and leaders have the ability to change that narrative. It got changed, and just by pulling it off the air, people thought that that movement stopped. Or it gave this appearance that there was some type of success, and as a public, we move on, right? But those type of things that happen has the ability of all these different groups of power versus those with non-power, and how we interact with those. The police brutality, the whole issue around Colin Kaepernick nowadays, that generation, that we still have to pass on that safety for our kids. And when it happens to that next generation and that they see it, that's when you get that third column over there that it really drives it home. And then this next generational, transgenerational transmission, it becomes to solidify and becomes their reality as well. And so we continue time after time. So it's not just someone falling through the ice and then over multi-generations, because that's not the reality, that people will forget about that traumatic event of falling through the ice and someone died. But yet when it happens time and time again to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, that is one of those realities there. And that's how you get that long-standing historical trauma and that reality. And then people who don't have that reality, like, everyone's going to fear a cop getting pulled over, but white people don't have that same fear of time and time again, generation after generation, people that look like them and act like them and think like them being exposed to that. It's not linked back to 100 years, hundreds of years in some instances. No, it might be sporadic. They might have someone who's very poor might have that intergenerational transmission, that one generation or two, because they don't like them or they're anti-government. You know, I don't know what the redneck anti-government, blah, 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 like, hey, that's your damn government. That shit's built to support you. I don't know why you're complaining about it. Other than the fact that we don't want to pay our taxes. Don't take away our guns. For what? They're not going to take away your guns. NRA issue. They're going to assure that you can buy as much guns as you want. So, institutions. Institutional responses, historical trauma, all these other things, what we have going on in this country, and it's not these parts that are, people like, well, sociologists, for example, like, there is the term patriarchy that gets used in the domestic violence field, like, we're undoing the patriarchy. And really, when you look at the history of how that word came about, it was because sociologists and academics could not agree on sexism. Because there's people who say there's no such thing as an ism. There's no institutionalized structure because there's no puppet master behind the scenes actually controlling the way institutions run. Like, no, because you can't point to one person doing it does not mean that there is an institutional structure that exists. Example, heterosexism. You know, people get somewhat confused with homophobia, but there's two very distinct things about it. The ism parts are always about the institution. Heterosexism, this inherent bias in institutions by saying marriage is between a man and a woman. That is a law, was a law in some places. But it's a value inside that has been hundreds of years in place. And that is something that undoing that type of institutional ism, form of oppression that actually puts one group of people outside of there and benefits a different group, right? That's what people miss. It's like, how does that one group benefit and these other groups don't? Now I got my whole different theory on that, because when you really look at who loses by having same-sex couple married? When you have that thought and it gets promoted to heterosexual people, and we are the ones who get played inside of that argument using that narrative and saying, who loses? And you get filled with, oh, well, we have to pay more in taxes, or we have to pay more in this or that. And that's not the truth. That's not really the reality. Whose storyline and narrative and promotion of beliefs are about man and woman? And when you really think about it, it's religious. Christian Catholic cultures are the ones who are really losing out. They're the ones who lose some type of power because of their gender shaming, their whole doctrine and all these other things. It loses their influence on that to have that type of equality. Any type of division of any groups is beneficial to them. And so by promoting this and all this and saying, hey, they're messing up your rights, and you're like, no, it's not. It doesn't matter. Any couple can get married, and it's still an organization has to pay the benefits of that partner. Like, so what? It doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. But the narrative they try to tell you is somehow there's benefit and you're going to lose something. And those of us who move up from here, from the bottom of the pyramid, and move up a little bit here, a little bit here, we're still way away from the top. But yet, we really want to struggle to get there, and we really want, we really feel and get believed that we deserve what we earn, and no one should be able to take that away from us. But, you know, that happens. All right. So, the institutional response to this is that institutions are there to manage people. So, whatever institutions do, they are also structured on simplicity because they're managing people. An institution is not effective when it's accounting for each individual circumstance. You go to get medical assistance, they're only going to deal with your medical assistance. Medicare, any of that public medical stuff is huge. It's a huge, ginormous system. And what it takes just to get someone medical coverage is a huge factor. If you're going on welfare, TANF. Anything that's out of there that their job is to say, well, people coming on TANF need jobs, and the assumption is that they don't have the ability or capacity to get a job themselves. So whatever happens in that institution, like you may know how to get a job or have a job, you're just temporarily without a job. And so you may need some assistance. But because of the institution responding to so many people, they go to the lowest common denominator and assume everyone needs to go in there, a job training program. And the job training programs aren't even job training. They're like how to write a resume, what are your transferable skills? Meaning, okay, if I learn ditch digging over here, I can transfer ditch digging over there and maybe become a fence post installer versus a ditch digger because I can use a shovel. Or management experience. I could transfer that over to something else, doing some kind of management supervision type of thing. So those type of structures that our institutions and our organizations do it, like even human services, we may not be like up here with a lot of power, but we're a domestic violence organization that work with men who batter. We do want to say, no matter who comes in, we want to produce this one person who is nonviolent coming out. So they lose all their identity and they come out as a universal person. We want these stereotypes, we want these cookie cutters. I say that not to be like, okay, everything is inherently bad, but because of the ability to have flexibility, when you say we have the capacity to do something and that we're going to ensure that we do this most effectively 80 to 100% of the time, that's what we're looking at. So someone comes into TANF, needs some job training, we say, all right, when they come out, this is what they're going to have, X, Y, and Z. Whether or not you need it, you're going to come out with that. Programs, child protection, the same thing. They got the same kind of outcomes. You got one of two choices. Kids are with you or kids are permanently placed outside of you. But no matter your dynamics, how you got there, it'll be that's the result. And so understanding that, when we get into this particular segment or this particular slide, thinking of trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is how an institution accounts for individuals coming in. So we know you're going to have a common outcome, right? That you have a desire for, these are skills you can deliver to a person or transfer to a person as a result of coming through your program. But in a trauma-informed way, that you're also understanding the people who are coming from, it's going to be 100 different people with 100 different unique things. And they're going to come to you needing various things. So you can't just come in and say, we're going to deal with you this way, or that because 20 of you all experience violence in the home that you all need this type of response. Some people have other skills of vocalizing. Other people have personality traits of, being a little bit more detached, where that doesn't, they don't internalize so much. Other people were able to cope along the way. And so you're all going to get different things about that impact. But really, these are the things as an institution, being trauma-informed is what you need to do. And so safety is number one. You need to create that space where there's safety there. People need that time, opportunity to express what's on their mind, what their concerns are and their fears, because if you don't have that safe space, there's no way you're going to open up and heal as an individual. The trustworthiness and transparency. I love that organizations always promise people everything. Oh, we're going to do this. It's going to be so great. But yet you don't really sit back and look at, what do we really deliver? What do we truly deliver? And I know people are coming in for help, and you're going to want to help. You're going to promise everything because you're a great person. You're such a nice person that you're going to do this. But the reality is you may not have the capacity. And that's okay. And that's where the transparency is there. Trustworthiness is about being able to deliver on what you promised. The transparency is also being honest with what it is you do offer. Don't promise people things that you can't deliver. We are adults. There is no way I'm going to walk into McDonald's and demand that they serve me onion rings just because Burger King has them. Two restaurants that are essentially the same. I know what I'm going to get when I go to McDonald's. I know their menu options. I'm an adult. I'm not going to complain about not having onion rings. That's the way it works. We know that as long as we're honest with people, we're not going to say, oh, we'll help you. We'll get everything. We'll do this and that, whatever it may be, because we want people to come see us. Honesty and saying, okay, this is what we offer. This is where we can help you. And when something does not match and their need does not match your need, then it's okay. Maybe help them find where to get that need. I think peer support is also one of these things that are vital and important. That's why people get connected up. Support groups are very popular. Peer-to-peer, strength-based learning, peer learning, whatever it is, community gatherings, forums, all of that creates opportunity for peer support. We have to get people connected up with one another in order to build upon that and learn from one another. Our collaboration and mutual focus, some of it's with the people we work with, but also we have to extend our connections with other organizations, places, or groups. That collaboration is a huge one because as an individual, we know we're limited in how far we can go, but we also need those things also to deliver services and have more resources and support for our own work. For an individual, the empowerment, voice, and choice, that's leading, that's where it's their ability. Like they have to decide how far they're going to go, how fast they're going to go, and when they're going to go. We may have an idea in our head like, hey, someone comes to our program and it's a 6-month program, so we think no matter where you are coming in 6 months, you got to be coming out. May not work that way for individuals. Some people may come in and they're only going to do a couple of your groups or meet with you a few times. But this person may come back and you may see this person over 3 years in your services, whatever it may be. And also their choice. Don't push something on someone that they don't need. And also the thing about empowerment, people think you can bestow power on someone else. And that's really not what empowerment is. Empowerment is something that comes from within. Having capacity, having confidence is a result of you making decisions and your own actions and having your own success and failure. So what you have to do to truly empower communities is give information, give access, give opportunities for them to try and fail and do these other things, voice and choice as part of that. You have people, they might not say or come from the same place you are, but having that voice to express what it is that they're going through, what's their reality, having that option to move through things. So even as a service provider or as an institution, we say we may empower, but really we don't always empower. And I like to pick on domestic violence shelters for this. Domestic violence shelters are always about empowering women. Usually somewhere in every mission statement it says empowerment, but yet the first moment you come into a shelter, usually you have to do an intake. And you spend an hour or two, you just got beat up, you go in there and your safety needs and whatever, but you spend an hour or 2 hours talking through some paperwork. And then you're in there and you're not allowed to heal and rest, whatever. You have to do chores, you have meeting schedules, you do all these other things. And you have curfews, you can't bring in bedding in some places because of bugs, lice, those kind of things. You can't tell anyone where you're at. You may not be able to bring a child, a male child over the age of 14, 15, 16, that's pretty common as well. So when we say here's a place that's empowering, but yet the moment you start stepping in the doors, everything's being stripped away. That's not empowering. But people say, well, yeah, well, it was great because the women left and they did this on there. But, that maybe it fit that small sliver of people. It's not everyone coming in that's really empowering. It's only a small number. And again, part of that is going back to what are cultural, historical, and gender issues that are part of it. And so that's what trauma-informed means as an institution. It's an institutional response. Most people think trauma-informed is an individual skill knowledge response. Because I went to some conference and I got trained on trauma responses, or I got trained on using the ACEs quiz, I understand trauma, so I'm trauma informed, like knowledge. And you're like, no, you big dummy, that's not it at all. Trauma informed practices are institutional practices that allow for differential treatment of individuals and their inclusion inside of the decision making on what's most beneficial for them. So this is the closing activity that I wanted to include in there. So again, people are back in groups because I don't want to be all left with here's something heavy and like it seems hopeless because it goes on and on and on for hundreds and hundreds of years that we've been going through a lot of this stuff. And that how people are active inside of there. And so they might be able to pick a topic, or you just may do randomly whatever, pick a group. Pick Native people, or you may pick individual battered women and go for what's this whole practice, what's the experience, what are the patterns. So what, number one is what's going on with people's lives, what is their lived experience with number one. And then number two, you're looking for the patterns. What are some patterns? What are some common things that these people are experiencing? And then add new information and theory to it. So what is going on with it? Is there a particular trend? There is trends that come up in policing all the time. Every 20 years, 15 years, it seems like, is community policing becomes a very big deal. So you always get these peaks and valleys, you know, or cyclical maybe, I don't know if peak and valley, but very militarized responses, and then it changes back to we want the good old-fashioned beat cop again. You know, we want that good old Andy Griffith type of show going on, friendly neighborhood cop walking the beat, helping you out, get cats out of the trees, whatever. And then we shift from like 80s gang riot squad, busting up your house, go bust up that crack house and, you know, provide safety for the rest of us in the community, whatever it is, right? So what are the things going on? What are the theories behind it? What changes? What are trends? Because that type of thing about new information and theory are trends and changes in how someone responds or a group responds. If it's individual groups, what is something that provides new information and theory in a way of looking at that issue? For battered women, for example, that we're finally looking at the fact that all of our organizing has been around when women are leaving. So women get beat up in the 70s, so at a crisis after being beat up, need a place to go that's immediately safe. So we have safe homes and shelters that were created. Women don't stay there long, they go back home afterwards. And so what are protections that need to happen a little bit more? 80s, we got civil protection orders that were created and mandatory arrest laws. So all these other charges that happened in the 70s, there was no laws for wife abuse, spousal abuse. You actually had to do a citizen's arrest in order for the cops to arrest the person that beat you up. And so now we had mandatory arrest in the 90s. And so that meant that women in crisis getting beat up had a little bit more security after that leaving, after that safety. And so they have court orders to restrain men from the house. They also had men going to jail, having a consequence. So then what happens after that? A stronger criminal justice response. And that's happened in the 90s. You had a lot of this coordinated community response. People say CCR left and right. I have a coordinated community response to this. I have a coordinated community response to that. It's whatever. It's played out. The term doesn't accurately describe what's going on, but it's institutional policy change and public policy work that was in the 90s. And so we're changing the way laws are written, codified. The Violence Against Women Act, federal act gets passed. Gun laws, all these other protections, a protection order, full faith and credit, now being able to go, you know, anywhere with that, and that should be valid. So all these other things start to extend a little bit more and more and farther. So we got the women who are now leaving. They got more protection afterwards. We have more accountability here than for men. So they're not just getting put in jail for 24 or 48 hours and going back home and being violent again. We have actual laws that say habitual offender, that you must prosecute, sentencing guidelines for judges, and the monitoring afterwards. And that's batterers intervention starts to become pretty popular then. So what do you do with all the men who batter? So you got batterers intervention groups and that. And then in the 2000s, the aught years, you get a lot of post-separation. Like, okay, now women have left and these batterers are out, but now what do? We still got these kids involved, and here's one parent here, and here's one parent there. And this parent wants to kill that other parent, so how do we create some safety? So you have custody visitation issues, legal advocacy, housing after leaving, and supervised visitation. Those are all big trends during the 2000s. And now we're looping back around to the teens again, 2013. It was like one of these big rounds of a lot of engaging men. We're going back almost to the beginning saying, okay, we keep having, 40 years we've intervened decade after decade, and we still have new people coming in. We still have that tornado and that funnel of new people coming in. We're trying to create that universal non-battered woman now and getting women to leave. We followed this cycle, and we're finally realizing, look, that's all we're doing. We've only organized on the path, the trajectory in the course that women go through when they decide to leave a relationship or trying to get out of a relationship or find safety. Because, women trying to leave, it's just guys just won't let them go. That's the whole issue. That's why it's power and control. That's why they got control issues, right? But we've only organized along that trajectory. So even looking at new information in theory is saying, what are we doing that's different? Instead of changing, how do we get battered women to safety from here to safety over here? How as a community we rally around women so that our communities are safe? And the same thing for children. How do we create communities that are safe for our children? Going back to the earlier point of our children are just exhibiting symptoms of living in a violent society. They're dropping out of school, they're using drugs and alcohol, all these other things that occupy their time in order to navigate the world that they're living in. And so then you need number 4. What are the skills, plans, actions, and all that you need to put in place? And then what are you going to do to actually make it happen? So then there we go. We're at the end of this discussion. I want to do a report back. What were some of the actions people say that they're going to do when they get back home? What are the things they're going to put in place? And then if there are any comments and questions. All right, so first round, let's see how this works. I want to see how this recording turns out. And then for those of you who are not going to be able to make the call, or even those of you going to be on the call, you can preview this video. And then we can have a discussion on what's missing, what can be added, if there's any things that need more clarification. And yeah, and this will be the kind of guide to what I was thinking when I put this presentation together.